My name is Leslie Wingo. I will be moderating our session today. We'll have a few minutes of conversation, then we're going to open it up for Q&A. All right? So I'm going to have each of our authors. I'm so excited to meet these ladies. I've read all of their books. I want you to introduce your book and then tell us, how do you find inspiration when you deal with such complex, layered challenges? And it's good stuff. It's good stuff. So I'll have you go first.
Introduce my book. So my book is called Plantains and Our Becoming, and it's sort of a little bit of everything. It's a coming-of-age story based on my upbringing between New York, the Dominican Republic, the South, and then it's also an exploration of love, an exploration of my roots, and an overarching theme of an exploration of the Black diaspora, and sort of how we can bridge that gap of differences and religions and language and cultures in a way that allows us to see each other's humanity and collective humanity. And so, yeah, it was just me wanting to explore my roots and gives other people inspiration to ask themselves the hard questions about where they come from and who they are and what they need to strip themselves of in order to show up for our collective humanity.
Hi, my name is Deborah Mouton, and my book is Black Chameleon, which is down here. And so my memoir centers on first collecting stories of the women in my family, and then second, I felt like there was not a lot of context around why they did the things they did, so I decided to start creating modern day mythology of Black American women that does not exist, but I feel like does in our language, to kind of give you context and understanding of the crazy women in my family, and also to explain some of our colloquialisms, right? Like, who is Boo Boo the Fool? I don't know, but what if we did, right? I think those things were really interesting to me. And so for me, wrestling in that space was about making, kind of filling the gap, like you said, right, of mythology and origin stories. And what does that look for, like, Black Americans that don't know what their tie back to a larger African diasporic experience looks like? Do we get to just have the permission to create our own myths? Do we get to explain ourselves? And if we do, why not now, right? Mm-hmm.
My name is Brianna Holt, and the name of my book is In Our Shoes, on being a young Black woman in not-so-post-racial America. I got inspiration when writing my book really from summer 2020, the reemergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. During this time, I did not feel comfortable being outside protesting for several reasons. This was the height of COVID. I also saw a lot of risks that people were taking when they were protesting outside. And I was working as a music and entertainment journalist at the time and decided, I could just pivot my writing to race and Black womanhood. And so during that time, during the online movements, I saw a lot of the posts that were being created during the summer of listening and learning were mostly by young Black women who were advocating for obstacles that we were facing that it seemed like the general public wasn't aware of. And in terms the general public wasn't aware of, like misogynoir, or blackfishing, or just these different things that we were experiencing. And so I wanted to write a more modern version to explore the obstacles and the trials that young Black, millennial, and Gen Z women are going through and facing.
All of your books had elements that made me laugh, they made me cry, they made me feel something that I felt seen in your books. And so part of my next question is, how do y'all find inspiration by writing about systems of oppressions? I mean, things that are super complicated. And the way all three of you wrote, it's inviting, where I'm like, I need to read more, I need to read more, I need to read more, to the point where my daughter's like, turn off the lights. So why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really this understanding that grief and joy live in the same space. We take these larger systems of oppression and we're like, how could you ever be joyous in that? But the reality is like we cry at weddings and we laugh at funerals, right? Mm. And so we already have this duality in our human experience that allows for multiple emotions. So it's like, how do I then take a very serious situation like, being outside and having the police put in a curfew because they think that people are gonna riot, when that was the farthest things from people's mind, and combine it with a love story about this man who I saw in a bar one time, y'all, he was fine, right? Right? So it's like, how do I combine those things so that you get the fullness of the moment, which is
Black women are often left out of these conversations, but we are the forefront of a lot of social justice movements, if you look through history, and even the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think when we think of George Floyd and even people before them and Breonna Taylor, one thing that people were shouting at the protests surrounding Breonna Taylor is say her name, because Black women are often forgot about when we talk about police brutality, when we talk about any form of racism that Black people are subjected to. We're usually left out of those conversations. When we talk about Black boys and Black men being murdered, I mean, they have Black mothers as well. And Black women are experiencing their own obstacles as well with sexual assault and also police brutality and discrimination in the workplace, all types of things. And I feel like I felt inspired just by wanting to give us a voice and put our stories forward as well.
So you bring up something that's interesting to me about women and Black women and their voice. So for Black History Month, I usually try to pull these quotes. And one year, I think it was last year, I'm like, I'm gonna do all Black women. And they were hard to find, especially for people who come from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Cuba. So my question for you is, how does that show up for you in terms of making sure women's voices are expressed, the things that you're talking about, and how do you find inspiration in so many things that are happening in the world?
Yeah, so how misogynoir permeates anywhere you go. And I was like, why is that? Why am I seeing the same type of disrespect that happens to women in the US? I'm seeing it in the Caribbean. Why is that? And I kept on asking myself, why is that? And it really just takes you looking around, looking at how colorism shows up, right? How anti-Blackness shows up, how folks are still being impacted by the violence of imperialism, the violence of colonialism. And so I wanted to express that and express the beauty of our culture, but also express where we need to show up. And so for me, it was super important that I was making those connections, you know, across oceans, across borders, because I was noticing how little that conversation was being had globally and across the diaspora. And one of the things that I noticed was that folks weren't even like aware of how that was showing up in culture, in music, you know, just in their everyday lives. Like, for example, a lot of the conversations I was having on the island with other Black women, for example, my gynecologist, who's a Black woman and she wears her afro, but she can do that because she is one of the founders of her hospital. So she has this sort of accessibility and privilege that she can wear her natural hair. Whereas a nurse or a secretary or anyone who's working there, who is young and working their way up the ladder in corporations on the island, they are forced to flat iron their hair. And so it's like little things like that, the way the body politics, right? A lot of the women end up getting surgery just to have a more acceptable body type, just to be able to get a corporate job on the island. And so it's like things like that that made me realize that Black women globally are living the same experiences of feeling like their bodies are constantly put on a scale. You know, the way they speak is constantly being scrutinized. The way they show up in the world is never considered enough. And so I had to ask myself, well, what can I do to help paint that picture for the audience?
I want to go back to you for a second, Brianna. In your book, you talk a lot about blackfishing. And so I was reading, I'm like, oh my God, I didn't catch that either. So when you talk about blackfishing, can you explain that to our audience in case they are unfamiliar with that term? And then also talk about how that shows up in culture, and to your point, what does that do for Black women?
Yeah, so blackfishing, I can't remember the definition. People I think, aren't aware of it or don't realize it because cosmetic surgery and cosmetic treatments and procedures have gotten so good that you kind of forget that, or you don't really realize that people are doing this. I think a great example, I'm just going to name this person, is Kylie Jenner. Is she a black fisher? I don't know necessarily if I would call her one, but I think if you look at how Kylie Jenner looked pre-cosmetic surgery, pre-treatments versus now, she looks very ethnically ambiguous. She almost looks like she could be biracial, like she might have black ancestry or a black parent. It's through the excessive tanning, it's through the lip filler, but it's also not just a physical thing, it's also through like the speaking with AAVE, speaking, I don't want to say black women speak a certain way, but speaking like similar, like ebonics and the mannerisms, and you see a lot of this on TikTok as well, where people are using black voiceovers and they are not black, and it almost reminds me, I write about it in my book, how it reminds me of like modern day minstrelsy, where it's like, I am a non-black person, but I'm going to take this black voiceover and I'm going to talk like this and do all this, and it's meant to be comical. Usually it's a comical video, and it's no different than minstrelsy, where you are dressing up as a black person, being comical, being funny, and it's very harmful because then it poses black women as this way, this comical way, and so when black women are advocating for safety or experiencing violence, people take them less seriously because we are seen as this like comical group of people through other people portraying us that way. And so for some people it's comical, but then for us it's considered uneducated or ghetto. And just having some other type of person be able to really have power in how you're perceived and portrayed is very dangerous. So yeah.
Yeah, I can see that show up in like little things like fingernails, and the long fingernails are now super popular. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
That's another, the grills.
And it's not to say that, I think like one thing I try to make clear in my book is like, it's okay if white women want to wear braids, or if people want to get, I mean, style is style and fashion is fashion. It's more so the issue that when black women do these things that are culturally black, on us it is seen unprofessional, ghetto, made us to seem uneducated. There's been plenty of times where before a job interview, when I'm applying for a new job or just presenting myself, I have my hair straight right now, usually, and a lot of times I wear braids, but I feel like, oh, this makes me look more professional. But then you can see like a white pop star wear braids, and all of a sudden they're called boxer braids, and they're trendy and they're cool. But on me, it could keep me from being perceived as someone who is worthy of this job or educated.
So Deborah, I want to talk to you about how privilege shows up. And I thought it was a fascinating take in your book in terms of what that looks like in terms of, I forgot what you called it, but the pink movement, so to speak.
Yes, the pink approach.
The pink approach,
Yeah.
the pink approach. So will you talk to us a little bit about privilege and how that shows up in your book?
Absolutely. I think, we all are multifaceted and have multiple identities, and we can put ourselves in multiple boxes, but at the forefront, I think, of my life has always been black versus woman. And those things have always been ones that I had to pick and choose who I was going to be today, right? Mm-hmm. When I step in a room, is it going to be, I'm going to take on the black cause and fight for it, or am I going to take on the feminism cause and I'm going to fight for it? Because there's very few spaces where both exist. And so I think there is a certain amount of privilege in that, right, of being able to be your whole self that some people can access that unfortunately I can't, and the specific story centers around the Women's March, where in Houston, I can't speak for everyone, but a lot of the black female leaders tried to join in and be part of those organizing movements, only to be told, this is not what this march is about, right? This march is about something else. Black women can take a sidestep. We're really pushing women here, and if you're not gonna, wear the pink vagina hats and get on board, then we don't really have space for you. And it was really difficult to try to explain to my daughter, this is a moment where you as a woman can come into yourself, accept only so much of yourself, because your blackness is not allowed here either. And so I think that's who we are, right, as writers. We're trying to figure out how to reconcile all of those identities in a space where they're all okay to be all at once, and it's just not an easy thing.
Yeah, I was thinking as I was reading the book and about how much privilege I have in terms of I can take time off to go be at a march, but not a lot of black women have that opportunity. Yeah.
Or I can take it off to be at a feminism march. I can't take it off to be at a black march, right? So I think like even that in and of itself is a certain kind of privilege, right? I was working at the time for a predominantly woman-run institution, so all things women were on the table, all things black, maybe not so much.
So we were talking about privilege in the green room, and I would like for you to share your perception, or you talk about it in the book in terms of having a blue passport and how that shows up for you and the so many different aspects of where you live and where you play and where you work.
Yeah. So we were talking about earlier how one of your favorite poems was Coming to America in 3 parts. And the poem, part 1 of that poem is about my grandmother who, through her privilege, was able to immigrate into the United States because my great-grandfather was a politician in the Dominican Republic. And so during the dictatorship, the end of the dictatorship in the Dominican Republic of the era of Trujillo, they were giving away visas. And so my grandmother, by way of having access on the island, right, was able to have some savings and pay some money and have my great-grandfather get her into the U.S. And so that's one side of the privilege, right? And then my father, my mother was able to have papers bought through my father and get her. She immigrated illegally, but she was able to get residency in America because of loopholes that were in place in the legal system here. And then she was able to come to America. And then I, being born in New York City, although I was born in the projects and I grew up in a very impoverished city, I still had, a local public library, and I still had access to many resources that have allowed me to become the writer I am today. And so the conversation that we were having was really just like, even within being systemically oppressed in some way in the U.S., it does not compare. It does not compare to the lack of access and infrastructure that I have seen writers who are my age struggling to make a career for themselves in the Dominican Republic. And so that's something that I hold dearly, because I know that if I am able to get free, I know I can help them get free. But if I pretend that I don't have some form of privilege by way of having a blue passport, it's a disservice to them and it's a disservice to me, because it's not allowing me to see how even within the ways we are marginalized here, we still have a privilege, and that is that we impact the world globally because we are part of the United States.
And the other thing that we talked about in the green room was what do you do when you get your power back? So I'm curious to know, do you feel like you've gotten your power back? Did you ever feel like you lost your power first? That's probably a better question.
Yeah, I mean, I think power is one of those tricky things. So the book that I put together was purposely not in chronological order, right? Because I don't feel like you come into, I'm not like, I got confidence at 13, right? Like, that's not a thing. I think over time you gain confidence in certain aspects of yourself until you arrive to be a different kind of person. And in that way, I think power works very similarly, right? Is that I gain a certain kind of power of how I show up in the world, early on. And that power gets amplified as experience moves, as, I own myself more. For me, a lot of the power that I struggle with in the book is thinking about my physical appearance, right? My size. I've always been a larger woman, and that's height and size, right? My dad was 6'7", right? Like, so I'm used to coming in the room and taking up more space. And that ability to take it up willingly and not to apologize for that taking up. Magic is this, right? It's just like dropped from the heavens, right? Like my pocket, all of the cares fell out. And I think from what I've been told by my 40 and 50-year-old friends, this only continues in gravity,
yes, it
right?
does.
So I'm looking forward to 40, y'all. Right, but this idea of, coming into your power, I think is very much that. When you have to push back and assert your power, you take a little bit more of it, and that means you own a little bit more of it, and you walk around with a little bit more of it.
How about you?
Yeah, I think I did write my book kind of in a chronological order. So it's part memoir, part cultural critique. And I start off by writing about experiences that black girls have all the way throughout adolescence and adulthood. And I noticed, in my book, the last chapter is probably where I start talking about my power. And I would say it was just 2 years ago. I was 26, and I was wrapping up the book, and I was really feeling like, okay, I'm at a point in I feel like I got my power from my career, where I felt like I don't really have to answer to anyone anymore, because now I have autonomy thanks to this book. I've always worked as a journalist and worked in predominantly white newsrooms and predominantly white spaces where I felt like I did need to code switch and make myself smaller and walk on, a tight line to be able to move up and excel in my career. And then finally being able to write a book, especially a book like this, about Black womanhood, I feel like now it's expected anywhere I work, anyone who hires me, they're gonna see that I wrote this book. Came from
I
for
love
me.
that. What I'd like to do is start opening it up for questions, but I have one more question before, so people have an opportunity to think through what they're going to say. And don't be shy. There's a microphone. There's a microphone right over here. Oh, is there? I can't. These glasses.
No, I
I'm
got
like,
you.
Thank you. The glasses. The world is doing this. It's crazy. So, as y'all continue to develop your careers and you continue to grow and you start thinking about, I'm unapologetic and I'm unafraid. Do your parents, or more specifically your mother, I would love to meet your mother.
She's right there.
Hi, Mom.
I'm gonna point her out. Yeah, that's my
Oh,
mom.
there's a story about you that I just
Oh, there's so many
love.
stories about my mom. I love her. She's awesome.
And you talk about your mom, but so how does mom come into this, and especially for Black women and Black moms? Rock, paper, scissors. You can go first.
Yeah, I think that I'm definitely my mother's daughter. I definitely, there are things in me that I didn't even know were in me that are of her. And so I always try to honor the matriarchs. I think that the matriarchs in my family especially have been such a fierce example of how to survive this world alive and whole. And I'm always I call them matatanas because I think they're just so badass. They're just they're not afraid to speak their truth. They don't hold anything in their chests. They don't have high blood pressure. They're just like, listen, we get this off our chest and we move forward. And I really honor that. And I think that's what's made me a writer, is that there are just things I can't swallow and I have to let the world know it is unacceptable. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, my mom is such an integral part of this book and also just my experience of understanding myself as a woman. And I think what the biggest thing for me was her permission, right? You know, like I was like, Mom, I'm gonna write about you. Do you wanna read it? And she was like, no. And then she was like, well, I wanna read it, but I wanna read it when it's published and when it's like, I don't wanna read it when you can make changes. And she was like, I want you to tell me your full experience and your truth, and I wanna live with your truth, right? And I think that there's something just so beautiful about having a support system that says, we want you to be your full self and not have to mute yourself. Like, come into the world and tell them how you see the world, and we'll back you even if we don't agree with you. Of them, but most of the time it's like, you know, that didn't happen that way, right? And I'm like, that's how I remember it. She's like, yeah, that you weren't even that old. And I'm like, oops, right? So
It's your book. You get to be the hero of your story.
exactly, right? I get revisionist history of my own story, which I love. And so, you know, but I think that having someone in your corner like that, you know, my mom travels with me often. She shows up to events, she takes pictures, and she's also like the best hype woman. Like, she'll be like, did you hear my daughter's book though? And then she gets me book sales. She's magic, y'all. I need to pay her, but I'm not. I love you. So yeah, I think, you know, for me, that's the space of moms. And that's the space I think as a mom I want to be for my daughter, you know. I want to hype her up. I want to tell her she's amazing. I want to give her all the room in the world to be everything she wants to be, even if I don't agree with it. And so it is that lineage, you know.
Yeah, my mom was a big inspiration for this book because I was quarantined at her house during COVID when I got the idea for the book, and I was writing a lot of articles about race then, and it was during that time in COVID when there was nothing to do. You weren't leaving your house. You were like wiping down your groceries with like sanitizing wipes. Like, everybody was extremely afraid. And so we were just at home, and I would read the drafts of these articles that I was writing out loud to my mom, and that's when it kind of clicked for me that there is this lack of knowledge that older generations have about what millennial and younger Black women are experiencing. And so it was with conversations that I was having with my mom that really came to this idea about like, oh, this is a book that there's a need here. I think when you're an author, you're trying to figure out what hasn't been written or where is there a need. And she's been super supportive. She's come to several of the events on my book tour, came to another book festival with me, is here right now, and brought like 6 of her friends.
Hey, friends. Hi, Mom.
And
Hey, Mom.
yeah, her friends are here, my friends aren't here. So, so extremely supportive. And it's also, I think this book has, I'm gonna get a little emotional. I think it's brought me and my mom closer because I think there's a lot of things that I was going through in my childhood that I think a lot of people in my family weren't realizing until they read this book. And so it's been able to open space for a lot of conversations to really like go back and talk about some of those traumas that I had and really like reconcile with them. So.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
And you write in your book about your childhood and some of the things that you experienced, especially with your dad and his passing. Would you share a little bit about how you can think through those stories and write about those stories, because they were beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's about, I think there's 3 or 4 poems, but the 3 big ones that come up for me are Telling Time, Child's Play at a Funeral, and Dance with Me. And so it's sort of like different stages of grief. In Telling Time, I'm like an angry child, and I'm feeling very like grief is sitting in my chest in a very angry way. And it's really because when I was a kid, my dad gave me this like heart-shaped, it's like, it was like, you could tell time on it, and it was heart-shaped and it was pink, and I ended up throwing it away as a kid. And that's one of my, and I still look for this toy, because I remember we got it in a pharmacy in the Bronx, and I still look for this toy, but I threw it away as a kid because every time I looked at it, it made me cry, because as I was getting older, I finally understood what death meant. And when I was 7 and my dad died, it was through Child's Play we understand that children don't really have a concept of death at a very young age. And so when someone in your family who is important to you dies, you're like, oh, they're dead, and then you forget. You'll cry about it for like 2 seconds, and then you forget, and you go and play. And so for me, that's what grieving my dad the first year was I would go play and forget about it, and then I would remember, and I would be like, what does it even mean, and go play again. And so, but then we move on to Dance with Me, where we sort of have a reconciliation of that grief, and that grief sort of just turns into being able to understand that just because someone dies doesn't mean they leave you. That you can still access them, and they're always a part of you because their spirit will always be here. And so I kind of moved through that in a sort of loving way to just be able to understand what death at least means to me and how I want to navigate it.
I would like to open it up for questions if anybody has a question for our authors, but I want to ask the 3 of you, as Black women, as authors doing multiple things, I think y'all are doing all sorts of things that y'all write about, and then there's probably a million things that y'all have going on in the background that just exist from living. How hard was it to become an author and to find your voice and to break through in this industry?
It's heavy.
Is that a tough one?
I'll start. It was very hard. I never saw myself as an author. I went to journalism school here at UT. And I just always thought I was going to be a journalist. And then, again, summer 2020, I pivoted from writing about music and entertainment to race. And these pieces started going viral. I was writing for the New York Times and speaking on news shows, and then woke up one morning, and this one piece I wrote about Juneteenth for New York Times was like, that the hashtag publishing paid me had just came out, and it revealed that Black authors were the least paid authors in publishing. I think Roxane Gay's first book deal was like $15,000, and then and I mean, this is a great example of allyship, because these white authors were coming out of the woodworks and they were like, they paid me $800,000 to write a romance book, you guys deserve more. And so people were being very honest about the money they were making. And so I think the literary agents were interested in my writing, but also saw an opportunity for all of us to make money. And so I was like, yeah, I guess I'll work on a proposal. And I had no idea what I was signing myself up for. I think the timing of when I got my book deal was a very stressful time. Again, summer 2020, they wanted me to write my book in 6 months, and then it was 9 months, and then we finally settled on a year. I was like, there's no way I can do a reported 300-plus page book in 6 months while working a full-time job. And it was really stressful. It wasn't fun to interview the interviews that I was doing for this book, but it's very rewarding, and I'm very glad that I did it. I don't know, I've talked to a lot of authors here, and they're like, yeah, I'm working on my second book. What are you working on? I'm like, I'm not working on another book anytime soon.
Tired.
No.
Tired.
So, yeah, tired. So yeah.
What about you, Deborah?
Yeah, I think it depends on how you define yourself as an author. I think I was authoring books at like 6, right? Like, I'm just gonna be honest with you. Like, I had little pages I folded in, and I wrote my name on the front and was like, written by Deborah, right? Like, I think like at that age, I was like, my idea in my mind ideally is to write books that I can read later to people and they listen to them and all of us enjoy it, you know? And that's like a very superficial level of it. I think when it gets to the industry, I published my first book at 19. I self-published. While I was in college. My next book came like 15 years later with an indie press, and then like 4 years after that, I was with the Big Five. So I think it just at each level, it was a different kind of expectation. Success looked very different for me at each one of those, and access was very different. You know, with self-publishing, I could just write a book, you know, right? And then I could just get a friend to edit it, and bam, there's a book in the world. But that book's distribution is to make connections for me, to connect me with a great agent that could get the book out in the world where it needed to be.
Yeah, I love that you said leaning on community, because honestly, that's the only way I was able to get where I am now. And I'm so grateful for all of the writers and the women who helped me. I mean, it took a friend of mine who's a writer who introduced me to my agents. It was another friend who gave me an opportunity to, Elizabeth Acevedo gave me the opportunity to do the narration for her audiobook, and that got me 2 Audie awards. And that's really what propelled me to be able to get a good book deal, because, I mean, if you're not given the opportunities and you're not given the resources, you can't get anywhere. The industry is like, we are decimal points. You know, we are black women writers are decimal points in this industry, and we are often not given the opportunities because sometimes they have a million excuses. They don't know how to market us. They don't know how to put the story together. They don't know if it's going to sell. But it's just like, you don't give us enough opportunities to even have us prove that it sells, because there's this idea that black folks don't read books. And it's just like, who told you that? We've been reading Toni Morrison since Toni Morrison. Like, you know. So yeah, it's super important that, you know, as we grow and as we, get these opportunities, that we're able to, pull that ladder down and help somebody else make it up, because that's the only way we're able to thrive.